Hello, welcome to It's Your Smarter Money with Atlas Fiduciary Financial. Today, we want to talk about a common problem that we have in the world of investing. And it's the whole idea that one thing that we know for certain when we're investing and making financial decisions is that our outcome is going to be uncertain. And that isn't a concern because we don't know when we're making a financial decision or an investment decision what the true outcome is going to be until after the fact. So, a lot of times investors will just make assumptions around what they think is going to happen. With maybe they're optimistic or maybe they're pessimistic. Sometimes they look at historical performance and they say, oh, what happened in the past is going to happen in the future. And Steve and I have been trained quite well by the SEC that we cannot ever look at the history and expect that to be the future. In fact, law requires that we tell you that. So
Yep.
what do people do when there's uncertainty? Well, there's a second slide which shows a man looking at a bunch of question marks and wonders what he would actually do. And one of the things that is actually, there's a PhD, Nobel Prize winning PhD who talks about all the different biases. His name is Kahneman, and he talks about one of the problems when it comes to making decisions, financial decisions, investments decisions, is overconfidence. And so we want to eliminate that idea that we could be biased, whether we're optimistic or we're pessimistic or whether we're overconfident. We want to get down to what are our real expectations in terms of the future. What is the upside? What is the downside? I know that when I was in business, we use this all the time. Anytime a CEO wanted to make a decision, they would ask for what is our expected outcome for this investment? What is the worst case scenario that could happen if, in fact, everything went wrong? What is the best case if everything went right? And so understanding the breadth of the different outcomes becomes very important.
Yeah.
So,
And the other one is linear thinking. And that's the idea that, and it's typical for most of us as humans to think this way, because our brains are not really wired to think in terms of statistics. It's just because of our backgrounds and evolution and everything else. But linear thinking means we think that the future is going to look like the past. And we can tell you one thing, it's not going to look like the past. We just don't know how it's going to look. We do know that we can wrap some statistics around it and try to create some simulations in terms of how it's going to look. And I think that's really the topic of this video, right?
right. So the next slide talks about how you would actually approach choices around uncertain decisions. And the first two items really have to do with being very clear about what you want. And the second being certain about the fact that you know that whatever you want may not actually happen. I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I just noticed we misspelled during. Sorry.
Oh.
I'll point it out before anybody else does.
Yes, okay, good. Well, we should look at our slides before we show them. But the point is that we really want to understand what we're trying to get at, where we're trying to go, what is the possibility that could happen. And so the last two rules are about thinking statistically and calculating the possible outcomes become really key. And there's an analysis that we use to do this.
Yeah, and it's important to think statistically because it's so easy to be fooled. And I see it all the time in the media and other places. For example, I'll just give a quick example. You might see all those stories about a cancer cluster, for example, that it's really a weird coincidence that 8 people in the same town got the same type of cancer. But it's not really that weird if you understand statistics, and it doesn't really mean anything bad in particular is happening. It's like flipping a coin. Can you get heads 20 times in a row? Sure you can, but the odds are quite small. But if you keep doing it, if you have 100,000 people doing it, somebody's going to have heads 20 times in a row. So it's important to think statistically because it does change your outlook on things.
So when faced with a significant uncertainty and you want to make a forecast, you want to make a prediction, the idea of using simulations, we call them Monte Carlo simulations, is a great way of thinking statistically and calculating your outcomes. And so the definition of Monte Carlo simulations is just really the application of applying variables that are random and seeing how they potentially could result in a range of different outcomes.
Yeah, and what we mean by random is, in other words, and they're not there. Even the data we use, we use random numbers. It doesn't completely model the way the real world works for various reasons. But random means that the return in the market last month does not affect the return in the market this month. They're completely random, and they're not connected to each other. And we know that's not completely true, but we have to make that assumption here.
But Steve, we should say too that they're also not abstractly random. In other words, they're within a realistic bound.
That's
They're
correct.
around what. So if we said the return of the U.S. stock market, maybe we would say, okay, a number like 4 or 8 or 15 makes sense. We're not going to have numbers like 95.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yep. That's correct. So Monte Carlo as a process, Laura pointed out that it was actually used in the 1800s, she thinks, but its modern, its use in more modern ways actually started in the late 1930s, in the 1940s. There were a couple of mathematicians that sort of perfected its use in a modern way. And that is, one fellow's name was Stanislaw. The other one's name was, I just had it, right? It wasn't Turing, it was the other fellow. I can't think of his name. We were just talking about it. But it was used extensively in the Manhattan Project. And in the Manhattan Project, they were figuring out what the odds were that a neutron from an atom that split would actually hit another atom and cause it to split as well, such that that process became self-sustaining. In effect, you have a nuclear reactor or a nuclear bomb, one of the two. So they had to use a statistical process to try to run these simulations, to try to determine, for example, how much plutonium you need to have a nuclear bomb versus how can you run a nuclear reactor without having it go critical. Critical means out of control. And so one of the physicists thought it was pretty funny that the way they were doing things. So he decided to call it Monte Carlo. He said, gee, this is like being at Monte Carlo and gambling, which is how it acquired the name. And it's not really a good name, frankly, but that's what people use it. They call it Monte Carlo. Yeah, and so it has been used.
Really probability.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And it's used all across a lot of the technical fields in science and engineering. I was telling Laura, I was an engineer back in the 1980s. We were using it when I was an engineer. But its adoption by the financial planning profession really occurred during the 1990s. Actually, his name was Lynn Hopewell, I believe. This occurred to me, the fellow. He was an engineer. And he sort of challenged the profession and saying, why are we still using static projections? Static meaning we're assuming the same rate of return on your portfolio and the same inflation rate every year and projecting that into 30 years for your lifetime. Why are we not using a statistical process that sort of better matches the real world? And it was adopted initially in spreadsheets in the 1990s. And then a lot of the providers of financial planning software recognized the weakness they had in their software. And almost all of them, in fact, I think all of them do, added it into their software programs. And so everybody in the financial planning profession, for the most part, started using it. Although I will mention, I have seen a couple plans people brought to us that were prepared by other companies. They did not use it. If they're not using it, they're I'll tell you, they're really it's a real misservice to their clients if they don't use it.
Well, there are a lot of people that also use Monte Carlo software and they don't understand how to apply it. And in that case, you might as well just use a straight line. I wanted to say that it's really the expansion of the different industries that use Monte Carlo is rather large, and people don't realize they use it in healthcare and astronomy and telecoms and particle physics and all kinds of things. And we generally use it for 2 applications, maybe even 3. It's used primarily in finance to price out options. It's used to do financial planning when doing projections in retirement and whether you're going to run out of money. We also use it in hypothetical examples to see how well investments might do over a 20-year period of time. So you'll see us use Monte Carlo in various scenarios.
Well, I want to add a fourth thing. We actually use it to develop the investment models that we have our
Sure.
clients invested in.
Yeah, right.
And we use a process called robust portfolio optimization. It's a much more advanced and I would say statistically useful process to develop portfolios rather than just assuming that investment return and correlations are the same every year. And so we kind of touched
goes
on
well
this.
beyond.
Yep. We kind of touched on this already. A lot of times when you see projections in our software, we can't, because when we use the Monte Carlo process, we're going through thousands of simulations. We obviously can't show everyone in a document, although the document will be 10,000 pages long. So when you receive a financial plan from us, the actual tables are more reflective of the static analysis. But the critical component of that analysis is the Monte Carlo page, which we give you, which gives you some idea what the odds are that you might have to change your expenses at some point, which we'll talk about that a little bit.
And so we use 1,000 trials, 1,000 times where we're rolling the dice and we're saying, what if this happens? What if that happens? And so there's many iterations of the randomization of these different variables.
I like to tell people it's 1,000 lifetimes. We've projected 1,000 lifetimes for you, and we know which one's going to look different.
So this is a question. If you had two portfolios, one is portfolio A with an average return of 10%, a standard deviation of 15%. Would you care whether it was portfolio A, or would you care if it was portfolio B, which is, if you click the second time, Steve, it'll bring up portfolio B, which is also an average return of 10% and a volatility of 15%. Do you care, Steve, which portfolio you have?
Let's see. I would rather have the good returns first.
Okay. Well, it actually depends. And so if you hit one more time.
Well, it does depend. Yes. Yep.
Okay. So, and it depends where you are in terms of whether you're adding cash flows, whether you're not adding cash flows, or if it's just static. So the next slide shows that if you're,
in other words, whether you're dollar cost averaging to add to your portfolio or dollar cost averaging to take money out of it.
Right. So if you have either portfolio A or B and you're not doing anything with it, it's just you took money, you put it into the market and you let it ride for 30 years and didn't ever touch it. It really didn't matter. Good to bad or bad to good, it all ends up at the same place, which is fine.
Yep.
The real point, though, is if you wind up going to the next slide and you're now adding cash flows in when the market is not doing as well, as Steve just alluded to, you're putting money in when the returns are very low. And so then all of a sudden there's a big chunk of money that when it starts turning up, you wind up with more money than you would if it had been the reverse. And the opposite is the case when you're taking withdrawals out. And most of our clients are in a position where they're either starting or thinking about starting to take money out. Perhaps you're at the age where you're required to take minimum distributions and you're taking money out. And the problem is that if you're taking money out right from the get-go and the market does not do well, you might take so much out that there's no hope for return. And so we have to be very, very careful with that when we're doing projections into the future. And we're particularly, all of you know, if you come to us and you say, I'm getting ready to start taking distributions out of our portfolio, we're very, very careful to plan for that future, to understand where that cash is coming from.
Yeah. And so this possibility is incorporated in our projections when we go through the 1,000 trials, but we like to augment that usually by having just one worst case trial, which it's a static trial, but we assume that the market goes down, for example, 10% a year for the next 3 years. Because we want to try to see what effect the sequence, we call a sequence risk. And it's also called order of return risk. We want to see what effect that's going to have on your lifestyle going forward. So we do run that as a separate trial, by the way. But the Monte Carlo trial or process by its very nature does have these types of events incorporated within them.
Well, the Monte Carlo actually provides a first layer of attack in terms of being
Yes.
conservative and really understanding that. We then layer on top of that additional assumptions. What if we had a bear market that lasted for 3 years and was down 20% each year? We also do that sometimes if we think that there's long-term care concern, we might do a whole analysis around that. And we also do a third usual exposure around inflation. So being a conservative firm, we do tend to layer on some of these items.
Yep, that's correct. Yep. So we talked about this a little bit already. We go through 1,000 trials. Think of it as, in other words, it's like 1,000 different episodes of your lifetime. Each one's a little different than the other. And we randomly vary investment return, but within the ranges, or we use statistics that match the way we think you're going to be invested. So in other words, you're in model X, we know what the projected return might be. We know what the risk of that model might be. Those are the parameters we use in a Monte Carlo simulation, okay? And we also know what the correlations, which we're going to talk about in a minute, between these asset classes are, and how it affects your portfolio and the return of your portfolio through time, and also the risk. We also randomly vary inflation. We typically make it a little bit more conservative than historical inflation, which has averaged about 3% since 1926 or so. We've been using 4 lately to make it a little more conservative. And we count the number of successful trials. In other words, in how many trials did you not run out of money? And when we mean by money, we mean your portfolio, not your home or things of that nature. Also, of course, Social Security never ends, hopefully. How many trials did you not run out of money? And so sometimes we like to redescribe that in a different way, saying, all right, your success rate was 80%. That meant in 20% of the trials, there was a possibility you'd have to adjust your expenses to make sure that you don't run out of money. But what's important here is we run this analysis every year or two for you to make sure you're still on track and to make sure that your odds of success have not deteriorated. If they start to deteriorate, then that might be a time where we may recommend that you try to alter some of your variable expenses and try to reduce them to get that Monte Carlo to go back up over the next couple of years. So it can be used as a guideline. I wouldn't think of it as, gee, you ran a plan for me, and my odds are not running out of money, or only 70%. Well, think of it this way: there's a 30% chance you may have to make an adjustment. Okay. So you want to talk about this, Laura?
Sure. So there's a skill set in all of this that really is important, and probably the reason why some people don't even bother using Monte Carlo is that they don't understand how they have to identify the key assumptions. And so there's some basic key assumptions here around distributions are normally distributed, and that there's no what they call auto serial correlation, that each individual instance happens on its own. And we know that that's not always the case because of momentum and other aspects. But so you have to keep all these items in mind when you're looking at the data, and you have to understand how the data can sometimes point to a more conservative position, because it usually will be more conservative than not. And also understand your client. And so there are instances where it might come out to not be the best Monte Carlo number, if you will, but we know that there are other fallback scenarios and other things going on with the client's life that will say this is just fine. There are other times where it really does look bad, and we have to tell a client, we need to make some adjustment. You need to adjust either your spending, or we need to do something different. So it's always directional. None of these tools are ever, you don't ever use them just by themselves. You have to incorporate. I always like to say the work that we do, Steve, is there's a science, but there's also an art. And I think for both you and I, after being in this business for over 30 years, we've begun to learn how to really make art with the scientific data that we're getting.
Well, I think the last point here is very important too. When we run through Monte Carlo, we're assuming that you're a foolish automaton that never makes any adjustment. Even when you start running out of money, you're 90 years old and it looks like you're going to run out of money in 2 years. you would have made adjustments far before that, with our help. We would never let that happen. We rerun this every year or two and make sure you're still on track. Because it allows for mid-course corrections, and that's the key here too. And so we mentioned correlations earlier, and correlations are the interrelationship of asset classes to each other. In other words, when one goes up, does the other go up? And if it does go up, roughly how much does it go up in relation to investment A? So how much is investment B? How does investment B act under the same economic conditions as investment A, for example? And so we have a table of numbers here that sort of shows what happens. So it's hard to read here, but for example, the ones that are in like a tan color or orange color, those investments do not seem to move together. Their prices seem to move in opposite directions to each other. The ones that are blue, they tend to move together, and the darker the color, the more they seem to move together. Right? And that's the way to think about this. Now, I will mention that correlations, and that's a lot of advisors, I think, are not really careful in the way they look at correlations, because these are over many, many years, and they can change. And we've seen trends in correlations. We've seen plenty of times when international is highly correlated with domestic. We've seen times when that correlation dropped, for example. So you just can't really use static numbers. We've talked about this in other videos, but it is a starting point.
Well, that's what makes the Monte Carlo assumption set and the key data that's used so important, because not only is it getting the accuracy around your spending habits and your overall needs, but it's also using the three core components, which are return, volatility, which we use standard deviation, and although we use some other measurements with that even, and correlation, where, as Steve alluded to, we actually use some more sophisticated correlation measurements beyond just this normal linear type of correlation that we're showing here. But the correlation number, even if you just use this linear version of it, what's called the Pearson row,
yes,
still with 14 asset classes, which is the number of asset classes that we incorporate, that requires us to have 91 data points for the relationships between each of the sets of movements of each of these different asset classes, because they're all moving in concert, and it's a dance between all of them. So this correlation matrix is actually very important. And did you know, Steve, that I've seen people do Monte Carlo without even using correlations at all, just leaving it zero?
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Yeah. When I was teaching, I saw a couple of people that were doing that.
I want to mention that, actually, because I was going to mention this earlier. This made me think of it. I will have to say this. I think some of the training in the financial planning profession is not where it should be, because the CFP, while it's a great starting designation, you don't really learn statistics in the CFP program. And unless you've had it somewhere else, you may not really fully understand statistics. And quite honestly, even as an engineer, when I got my degree in engineering, we didn't have statistics. It was later on in life that I took statistics, and part of the CFA program, and my MBA in finance and other places. But a lot of people in the financial planning profession are not really well versed in statistics.
Yes, I learned my statistics in the MBA and also the PhD in investments. That's where we talk statistics, not
Yes,
CFP.
I know you.
And unfortunately,
you're very good at it.
In the profession, I can tell you that we just don't. That was not part of what was being tested.
Yep. And it's so real world, and it's so important for us to, as an advisor, to understand it. So here we can talk about, there are some weaknesses to Monte Carlo. There's no technique. That's perfect. It's still just better than the alternative, which is the static analysis. But first of all, the choice of the probability distribution does affect the results. And we mentioned that a lot of distributions are not necessarily normal, which means they don't follow that bell curve shape. But we do account for that in other ways within our profession, in our practice. And then we mentioned that the investment rates of return are not fully independent. There's something called serial correlation, and Monte Carlo doesn't really take that into account. But we know that we're familiar with these weaknesses, and we know enough to how to make some, I would say, off the cuff adjustments. And we mentioned that our investment return is really random. We talked about that already. They're not totally random. Probably over not a year or two, but when you start to get maybe over 2 or 3, 4 or 5 years, some of that interdependence of returns starts to diminish, by the way. And bad events may not be modeled enough. We do model it in our statistics, by the way. We saw black swans, and I'll say 2008 was close to a black swan. And that was a year where we saw everything become correlated. And last year, I'll call it a quasi black swan last year. Bonds, people always said bonds are not correlated to stock, which is not really true, because there have been plenty of periods of time in which they were. Well, we saw that last year, So it sort of was a black swan if you were in a 60-40 model, quite honestly. All right. And the sequence risk Laura mentioned earlier, what we do incorporate it in our projections by doing that bad bear market test to some extent. And it's important to understand the assumptions. And I think a lot of advisors even take the assumptions and they don't really consider them, how carefully they should make those assumptions and how poor some of them might be as well, by the way.
And one of the things that we find too is, so right now we're showing, you may have seen this particular depiction of a Monte Carlo analysis. Sometimes it won't even show you all the breadth. We'll just show you, okay, well here, it's in tabular format. What's the largest upside in, the lines that if we run 1,000 trials, those top 2.5% lines, what is the maximum they could reach? What is the lowest, the bottom 2.5%? And what is kind of the average where most of them are hovering around? And so in this instance, we would have told somebody, look, out of the 1,000 trials, 17% of those trials, or 170 of those trials, were not successful. They were not going to be okay. So if in fact we started getting to a situation that looks like we were not going to be successful, we would say, let's sit down and talk about change of spending. Let's talk about a change of your investment strategy, whatever it might be, but we'll have some conversations and we'll make some adjustments. Still, under normal circumstances, this is a fine scenario. We don't want every single scenario to be perfect. If this said 100%, basically what we're saying that there is no chance, no matter whatever happened, that anything could ever go wrong. And we would be actually being overly conservative by doing that. So we don't do that. But you may have seen this in your comprehensive plan, this type of table where it depicts this. Another table that you may have seen more usually when we're just looking at the investments and we're looking at how volatile the portfolio could be, just not even including spending, but just, what over a 20-year period could happen to your portfolio. And again, this is looking at the best case, all the stars line up, to the worst case, which is the worst thing happens. Unfortunately, we see a lot of people that will come into our firm with portfolios that they had created outside of us. And what we do is we stress test it and we look at it, what could happen with this portfolio over the next 20 years. And we would say, if you look at this chart, this particular portfolio, this was actually a client that came in fairly recently. They were getting an average rate of return of 4.7%. They said, well, we're conservative people. We're not shooting for a high return. Okay, fine. But for a 4.71, you still have a fairly high standard deviation of 8% there, and that's going to result in a larger breadth of outcomes. So $1 invested at the beginning of that 20-year period, on average of the 1,000 trials, $1 would wind up having some money at the end of the 20-year period, actually $2.86. And there is a maximum, if in fact everything went beautifully, of $7.75. But what we're concerned about is that minimum ending value. Is there a possibility that you could actually lose money in this portfolio based upon how it's designed? We don't like seeing this. We don't like seeing you break the buck in this instance ever. This shows that you could possibly lose 14% of your portfolio over a 20-year period. And
That's
so
right.
we're always looking at that bottom number to say, no, we don't want to take, we're protecting the downside first.
Yeah, and so this is a projection of the portfolio in isolation of their spending pattern. So if you layered their spending pattern on top of that 86 cents, it could be a bad situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
that's what we found too with this client.
Yep.
Was once we added that, it was not a good scenario.
Right.
Okay. So yeah, this is just one of the tools that we use in decision. We use quite a few different tools to determine how we should structure a portfolio that makes sense for you, whether your current living pattern and lifestyle is going to be sustainable over a longer period of time. The idea is for us to show you in a mirror, this is what's going on. This is something that you should be paying attention to and understanding so that you can make tweaks and adjustments along the way. Our objective overall is to help you be successful.
Yep, always.
So if you have any questions or thoughts around this particular analysis or want to hear about some of our other analysis, please let us know. We always enjoy doing this and hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you. Bye.